My name is Camille. I am 31 years old, and last weekend I found myself standing in front of my own house, frozen in disbelief, watching rainbow disco lights flash through the living room curtains and hearing bass-heavy children's party music shaking the walls. It was a surreal moment, one that would soon spiral into something far beyond anything I had ever expected. What began as a simple refusal to be taken advantage of turned into a scene straight out of a federal raid, with kids crying, parents screaming, and handcuffs snapping shut like clockwork. And I will never forget the look on my brother's face as he was dragged away, furious, humiliated, and completely caught off guard. It all started the week before, when my brother, Damon, asked if he could throw a birthday party for his son, Mason, at my house. Damon had a long history of taking advantage of people, especially me. He was the kind of man who acted like the world owed him space, time, and labor. His own apartment was too small, and the backyard of the condo he was renting was under renovation. So naturally, he turned to me. But I was tired of being the default solution to his problems. I told him no. I told him I had plans to come home, rest, and enjoy the quiet weekend I had earned after an intense workweek managing logistics for a distribution company in Charlotte. He did not yell. He did not argue. He just stared at me with a tight-lipped expression and nodded, but his eyes were cold. I could tell he was angry, but I assumed, wrongly, that it would end there. I underestimated his audacity. Damon had always been cunning, always weaving his selfish decisions into elaborate schemes that pushed responsibility onto everyone else while he strutted around acting like the victim. But this time, he went beyond anything I could have imagined. Friday evening, I stayed late at the office to finish a quarterly report. By the time I pulled up to my house in the suburbs near Freedom Park, it was already dark. But the neighborhood was glowing with energy, too much energy. As I turned the corner to my street, I noticed cars parked haphazardly on both sides of the road. Some were even up on the curb. I remember wondering if my neighbors were hosting a block party. But when I got closer, I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that all the cars were gathered around my house. And then I saw it. The pulsing lights flickering through my windows, the silhouettes of bouncing children, and adults milling around inside like they owned the place. I parked down the street and marched toward my front door in a rage. There was no mistaking it. Damon had broken into my house. He had thrown a full-blown birthday party for his son, uninvited, on my private property. My blood boiled as I walked up the driveway littered with confetti and juice boxes, hearing shrieking laughter and a microphone inside blasting someone's terrible karaoke. The nerve, the absolute nerve of him. I hesitated for only a second before I turned and pulled out my phone. I called the police. I told them someone had broken into my house. There were dozens of people inside, and that I did not feel safe entering. What I did not realize at the time was that my brother's little surprise party had triggered a much bigger alert. What I did not know then, and would only understand hours later, was that one of the guests at the party had been flagged on an active federal watch list. A parent of one of the kids, someone Damon had invited through his work or social circles, had a warrant out for crossing state lines with a minor while under investigation for neglect. My 911 call had been flagged, escalated, and rerouted. So instead of the local Charlotte police rolling up with flashing lights and a few patrol cars, it was the FBI that arrived. And they did not come quietly. I was still pacing on the sidewalk when the unmarked SUVs rolled in, 4 of them, followed by a black tactical van. Within seconds, agents in full gear surrounded my house. They did not ring the doorbell. They did not ask politely. They busted the door down with battering rams, stormed inside, and ordered everyone to the floor. I stood in my front yard, stunned, as I watched children being hurried out the back door by agents in tactical vests, one after another, their party hats tilted, their faces twisted in confusion and fear. Some of them were crying, but the agents moved quickly, systematically, making sure every child was accounted for. One by one, they were loaded into vans that would take them to a temporary Child Protective Services facility for emergency custody. As for the adults, every single one of them was cuffed and detained. It did not matter that some were neighbors, co-workers, or unknowing party guests. No one was let off without processing. They were all taken away to the station for questioning, my brother included. And Damon? Damon looked like he had been hit by a freight train. His smug arrogance was nowhere to be found. As the agents tightened the cuffs around his wrists and walked him out the door, he finally looked up and saw me standing at the edge of the yard, arms folded, expression cold. His mouth fell open in shock. His eyes widened with a fury I had never seen before. He tried to speak, but the agents pulled him toward the van, cutting him off mid-motion. He was furious. He wanted to scream, to accuse, to lash out. But he could not. Because he was caught red-handed, surrounded by federal agents, and drowning in consequences of his own making. He had thought I would come home, roll my eyes, and clean up after him like always. He thought I would say nothing, accept the invasion of my home, and let the party slide for the sake of keeping the peace. But he underestimated just how done I was with being the passive sister. He thought this stunt would force me to fold. Instead, it forced a raid. When the chaos ended and the house was finally cleared, one of the agents walked over to me and confirmed what I already suspected. I was not in trouble. I was the homeowner. I had made the right call. But my entire house was now sealed as part of a temporary investigation. It would take time to sort through all the legal fallout. I nodded in silence, trying to process the sheer madness of what had just happened. As I drove away to spend the night at a hotel, I looked back at the house one last time. The lights were off now. The music was gone. The balloons were deflated, and the yard was quiet. But in that stillness, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Relief. Relief that for once, Damon's recklessness had consequences he could not dodge. Relief that I had drawn a line and the universe, or the federal government, in this case, had backed me up. And somewhere beneath all the shock, the fear, and the disbelief, I felt something dangerously close to satisfaction. Because Damon would never forget this birthday party. Not because it was joyful, but because it was the day his games finally caught up to him. Update 1. If the night of the raid felt unreal, the days that followed felt like I was moving through thick fog, watching consequences ripple outward in slow motion. I learned very quickly that federal involvement does not end when the flashing lights disappear. It lingers. It digs. It documents everything. By the next afternoon, the situation became clearer. Every adult who had been dragged out of my house in handcuffs was processed, questioned, and eventually released. Some were let go within hours, others after a full night in holding, but one name never appeared on the release list. My brothers. Damon stayed. The reason was simple and devastating for him. He had illegally entered my home. He had organized and hosted a large event without permission. He had endangered minors by bringing them into a property he did not own or control. And on top of that, he had lied repeatedly during questioning, insisting that he had my consent and that I was exaggerating the situation. The evidence destroyed that story almost immediately. The security system logs showed forced entry. My phone records showed the earlier refusal. Neighbors confirmed I was not home when the party began. There was no wiggle room left for him. What surprised Damon the most was that everyone else walked free while he remained behind bars. The parents of the children were furious, embarrassed, and panicked about temporary CPS custody, but they were not charged with breaking and entering. They had trusted him. He had been the organizer, the instigator, the one who made the decision to use my home like a rental hall he could exploit. And federal authorities do not appreciate being lied to, especially not when children are involved. I was contacted again to confirm that I would not be dropping charges or offering any statement that might soften his situation. I did not hesitate. I confirmed everything I had already said. I clarified that Damon had been explicitly denied permission. I emphasized that I felt violated and unsafe. That was all they needed. That was when Damon realized he was alone. Through his attorney, he tried to reach me. At first, it was desperate pleading wrapped in fake remorse. He framed it as a misunderstanding, as a harmless party that went too far, as something that could be fixed if I would just help him out this one last time. He begged for me to say I had overreacted. He begged for me to claim stress, confusion, anything that would allow him to walk out. I refused. The tone changed instantly. When pleading failed, the mask dropped. I was informed that during a monitored call, Damon spiraled into rage when he learned I would not intervene. He stopped begging and started blaming. He accused me of destroying his life, of humiliating him in front of his son, of turning the government against him. Then the anger escalated into threats. He promised retaliation once he was released. He vowed to ruin my career, my reputation, my peace. He made it clear that he saw me as the enemy now, not his sister. That was the moment everything shifted from shocking to terrifying. Federal agents do not take threats lightly, especially not when they are directed at a cooperating witness. Damon did not seem to understand that his words were being recorded, logged, and assessed. He spoke recklessly, fueled by rage and entitlement, convinced that intimidation would succeed where manipulation failed. Instead, it sealed his fate. I was notified that his statements had been added to the case file. Not quietly noted, not brushed aside. Added. The agents explained that threatening behavior demonstrated a lack of remorse and a continued risk. His chance at leniency evaporated in real time. The same mouth he had used to bully his way through life had now dug his hole deeper. Hearing this did not make me feel powerful or victorious. It made me feel small. For the first time since all of this began, fear settled into my chest. Not the shock of discovering a party in my house. Not the disbelief of watching a federal raid unfold. This was different. This was personal. This was the realization that the man who shared my childhood memories was now openly promising to harm my future. I changed my routines. I double-checked locks. I slept with the lights on. Every unfamiliar sound outside made my heart race. I knew the authorities were involved. I knew there were protections in place. But fear is not logical. It does not care about reassurance or paperwork. It only cares that someone you once trusted now wants to hurt you. Damon was no longer just my irresponsible brother who crossed boundaries. He was someone capable of calculated cruelty when denied control. And as I lay awake at night, replaying his threats in my mind, I realized that the consequences of standing my ground were not over yet. They were only beginning. Update 2. When I first made the call to 911, I never imagined that within weeks, my brother would be standing before a federal judge in a courtroom downtown, his wrists cuffed, his lawyer scrambling, his face pale with disbelief. I thought the situation would drag, that it would stretch out in that slow, agonizing way legal matters usually do. But what I learned, what stunned me to my core, was that when the FBI decides to move, they move like a storm. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, phone records, witness statements, digital communications. Everything had been logged and presented with precision. The party itself was just the surface. The deeper issue, the criminal trespass, the violation of federal warnings, and especially the threats against a protected witness, became the sharpest knives in the case. Damon had turned what could have been a plea deal into a federal offense all on his own. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the sentencing came. The courtroom was filled with hushed voices and shifting glances. His attorney tried everything: character letters, explanations, even vague apologies. Nothing worked. The prosecutor laid out the facts with clarity. He had broken into my home. He had involved children. He had made serious threats while in custody. The judge did not need long. Damon was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. The courtroom went silent. His own attorney looked stunned. And Damon's expression cracked into something feral. He stood frozen for a full beat, not moving, just breathing hard, his eyes darting toward me in the gallery. Then the shouting started. Not with his voice, but with his body language. Rage poured out of him like gasoline on fire. Later, I learned the story behind what happened next. Pieces whispered by court staff, quietly confirmed by one of the agents. Apparently, Damon had tried to buy his way out of the sentence. In the days leading up to court, when it became clear that prison was a real possibility, he made contact with someone who claimed they could talk to the judge. It was all done through shadows, cryptic texts, quiet phone calls, cash handoffs. He paid thousands, convinced that his sentence would vanish, or at least shrink to a few months of house arrest. It was all a lie. The person he paid was a scammer with no ties to the court. The judge never knew. The money disappeared. And when sentencing came, there was no backdoor exit. No quiet pardon. No whispered mercy. Only the cold thud of a gavel and the unmistakable sound of shackles being tightened. When they led him out of the courtroom, he turned his head. His eyes locked onto mine like a predator memorizing its prey. That look, it was not sorrow, not regret. It was fury. Controlled, coiled, poisonous fury. He did not scream. He did not flail. He simply stared, unblinking, as if engraving my face into some personal ledger he intended to revisit one day. The officers had to pull him forward. I stayed seated, but my spine went stiff. My throat tightened. My hands gripped the edge of the bench so hard my knuckles ached. That look would haunt me longer than anything he ever said. It was a promise. Not loud, but loud enough for the soul to hear. After he was taken away, one of the agents approached me again, calm, measured, methodical. They assured me that all necessary precautions would be in place, that my testimony and cooperation had been critical, that Damon was now the government's concern. I nodded numbly, still trying to catch up with everything that had unfolded so quickly. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, the silence felt different. It was not peaceful. It was too heavy for that. But in that wait, there was also something else, respect. Respect for an institution I had underestimated. The FBI had come down on Damon not with force, but with purpose. They had not flinched. They had not negotiated with his tantrums. They had seen the entire chessboard, made their move, and left him checkmated without a sound. What left me most speechless was not just that they got him. It was how thoroughly, how completely, they unraveled him. His plan had been to hijack my house, hold a party, and twist public sympathy into guilt. Instead, he walked himself straight into a federal cage. I always thought revenge would feel explosive, loud, full of shouting and spectacle. But this was quieter, colder, more permanent, and far more terrifying. Because now I understood something no one had ever taught me before. When the FBI decides to take action, there are no second chances. There are no loopholes. There are no bribes. There is only justice, waiting in silence for the right moment to strike. Update 3. In the days following Damon's sentencing, I prepared myself for war. Not physical war, not another courtroom drama, but the quiet, lingering kind that creeps in after the dust has settled. I was bracing for the calls, the texts, the guilt trips from extended family, the whispered accusations about how I had ruined his life, how I had overreacted, how I had sold out my own blood. I knew how these things usually went. Families have a way of folding in on themselves when scandal breaks loose. Someone always ends up exiled, and I was sure it would be me. But what happened next defied every expectation I had. There was no backlash, no phone calls filled with judgment, no angry aunts accusing me of betrayal. Instead, there was silence, a strange, still silence that felt more like a collective exhale than condemnation. It started with my cousin Danielle, who texted me with a single sentence saying she was glad someone had finally stood up to Damon. Then my uncle called and said nothing about prison, only asked how I was doing. One by one, the family began reaching out, not with anger, but with relief. They did not see me as the destroyer. They saw me as the one who finally stopped him. But the most shocking reaction came from someone I had not heard from since the incident began, Lacey, Damon's wife. We had never been close. She had always kept a polite distance from me, like someone walking on a frozen lake, careful not to disturb the surface. I used to assume it was because she found our family dynamics exhausting, and maybe that was part of it. But when she asked to meet in person, I sensed that something heavier was coming. We sat in a quiet cafe on the east side of Charlotte, far away from our neighborhood, from the courtroom, from anything that might feel too loud. She looked like someone who had slept for the first time in years. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her eyes were clear. And then she thanked me. She said it plainly, without drama, without theatrics. She thanked me for getting him out of her life. That sentence cracked the floor beneath me. She told me how the last year had been nothing but shouting matches, threats, broken dishes, sudden disappearances for days at a time. How Damon's behavior had become darker, less predictable. How their son, Mason, had started flinching when the front door slammed. She confessed that she had been preparing to leave, but was terrified of what Damon would do when she finally told him. He had become volatile, controlling, obsessed with respect he had not earned. And when the raid happened, she had cried, not out of fear, but out of release. I sat there, completely still, as her words settled into my bones like cold water. The man I thought I knew, my brother who played pranks as a kid, who cried when our childhood dog died, who once built a treehouse with me in our grandparents' backyard, was gone. Or perhaps he had never been there to begin with. Perhaps the warmth I remembered had only ever been a disguise for something darker, something that had slowly uncoiled over the years until there was nothing left to hide behind. The real Damon was someone who threatened his own sister from behind bars. Someone who manipulated his wife into silence. Someone who thought breaking into my home and throwing a party for his son would force me to capitulate. Someone who tried to bribe a federal official because he believed rules were for people weaker than him. And when that failed, he turned to vengeance. Now that Lacey had spoken her truth, I realized how deeply I had misread everything. I had not just stood up for my own boundaries. I had unknowingly thrown a life raft to someone who had been sinking in silence. She and Mason had moved in with her parents temporarily, and for the first time in months, her son was sleeping through the night. That detail haunted me more than anything else. After our meeting, I walked for over an hour through Marshall Park, past the fountain, past the quiet benches, past people laughing and living lives untouched by federal courtrooms and betrayals. I needed to process everything. Not just the case, not just Damon's sentence, but the reality that I had spent years defending the wrong things. I had excused behavior, justified outbursts, rewritten history in my head to preserve a bond that had long since rotted beneath the surface. Damon was not a victim. He was not misunderstood. He was a storm that had swept through all our lives, and I had mistaken the thunder for sound and fury instead of warning. That night, I returned home and locked every door, not out of habit, but out of instinct. I no longer feared his physical return. 2 years in federal prison is not a quick stint, but something else had taken root. The uncertainty of who he had really become. The realization that I had never truly known him. That someone so close to me could have been so dangerous to the people around him, and that I had been blind to it. I stared at the spot near my front steps where the agents had pinned party guests to the ground. I remembered the way the lights had flashed through my windows that night. The laughter, the balloons, the music, and then the sirens, the shouting, the chaos. It all came back, vivid and sharp. But now it carried a different meaning. That raid had not just stopped a party. It had stopped a man who was on the verge of destroying more lives than just mine. The FBI had dismantled Damon's fantasy with surgical precision. They had not just answered my call. They had dug until the truth surfaced, even truths I did not know existed. They had exposed what I could not see. And for that, I was shaken, not just by their reach or their power, but by the fact that they had protected me from something I never realized I needed protection from. Because when justice comes wrapped in silence and certainty, when it strips away the lies without fanfare, it reveals not just the guilt of the one who committed the crime, but the naivety of those who never saw it coming. And that realization, that Damon was never who I thought he was the most frightening truth of all.